Welcome, friends. Today we're taking a journey through the cemeteries and memorial parks of America to visit 40 people who were, in their time, among the most famous faces on Earth. These were headliners, the names that topped the marquees, the faces that sold the tickets, the voices that filled the living rooms of millions. And yet, if you said most of their names today to your grandchildren, you'd get a blank stare in return. Fame, it turns out, has a shorter shelf life than we'd like to believe. So let's walk together, and let's remember them. We begin at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, which is to old Hollywood what Arlington is to the military. More Golden Age stars are buried within these rolling green hills than any other place on Earth. And our first stop is a woman who, for a brief and blazing moment in the 1920s, was the single biggest movie star in the world. Her name was Clara Bow, and they called her the It Girl. If you don't know what it meant, well, it was the 20s way of describing that indefinable quality. Sex appeal, magnetism, charisma, all rolled into one. Clara had it in spades. She was born into desperate poverty in Brooklyn, raised by a mother who suffered from severe mental illness, and a father who was mostly absent. One of her closest childhood friends burned to death when she was young, a trauma she carried for the rest of her life. She entered a magazine beauty contest as a teenager, won, and parlayed that into a movie contract. By 1927, the year her signature film was released, she was the highest-paid star at Paramount, earning $35,000 a week. She made 57 films in just over a decade. Audiences couldn't get enough of her. The red hair, the big expressive eyes, the irresistible energy. She was the first movie star to truly embody the flapper era. But the talkies brought trouble. Clara's thick Brooklyn accent and her crippling anxiety in front of the microphone made the transition brutal. Scandals, some real and some manufactured by a disloyal secretary, ravaged her reputation. By 1931, she was done with Hollywood entirely. She married cowboy actor Rex Bell, moved to a ranch in Nevada, and raised 2 sons. She spent her later years battling insomnia, anxiety, and chronic loneliness, often living in a small apartment with a private nurse for company. Clara Bow died of a heart attack in 1965. She was 60 years old. She rests here in the Freedom Mausoleum at Forest Lawn, interred beside her husband, who had served as Lieutenant Governor of Nevada. Stepping outside into the California sun, let's cross over to another section of Forest Lawn. Here lies a woman whose name, in the 1920s and 30s, was synonymous with MGM itself. Norma Shearer was known as the First Lady of the Screen, and for good reason. She was married to Irving Thalberg, the legendary boy wonder producer who ran MGM's creative operations. But to call Norma Shearer merely a producer's wife would be a grave injustice. She was a formidable talent in her own right. Born in Montreal in 1902, Shearer came to New York with her mother and sister after the family fortune collapsed. She modeled, she did extra work, and she was rejected repeatedly. The great D.W. Griffith told her she'd never make it because her eyes were no good. She had a slight cast in one eye that made her appear cross-eyed on camera. Rather than give up, she spent years doing exercises to strengthen her eye muscles and practicing poses in front of a mirror. By 1924, she was starring in MGM's very first official production, He Who Gets Slapped. She married Thalberg in 1927 and became the studio's reigning queen. Shearer was the first person ever to receive 5 Academy Award nominations for acting. She won Best Actress for The Divorcee in 1930, playing a boldly modern woman who demands the same sexual freedom as her unfaithful husband, a shocking role for its time. Her most remembered films today include The Women, opposite Joan Crawford and Rosalind Russell, and Marie Antoinette. After Thalberg's sudden death in 1936 at just 37 years old, Shearer continued making films for several more years, but turned down roles that might have cemented her legacy even further. She passed on Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, reportedly saying, "Scarlett is going to be a thankless role. The part I'd like to play is Rhett Butler." She retired in 1942, married a former ski instructor 11 years her junior, and gradually withdrew from public life. Norma Shearer died of bronchial pneumonia in 1983 at the age of 80. Her crypt in the Great Mausoleum is marked not with her famous name, but as Norma Arouge, her married name from her second husband. Also, here at Forest Lawn, in the Great Mausoleum, rests the woman who was, quite literally, Hollywood's first manufactured sex symbol. Her name was Theda Bara, and in her day, she was as famous as anyone alive. Born Theodosia Goodman in Cincinnati, Ohio, in 1885, the daughter of a Jewish tailor from Poland and a Swiss immigrant, she could hardly have had a more ordinary American upbringing. But ordinary doesn't sell tickets. When Fox Studios cast her in the 1915 film A Fool There Was, they concocted an entirely fictional biography. They told the press she was born in the shadow of the Egyptian pyramids, the daughter of an Arab sheikh and a French actress, and that her name was an anagram of Arab death. None of it was true, of course, but audiences ate it up. Theda Bara became the vamp, a seductress who destroyed men on screen and fascinated them in the theater seats. She made over 40 films for Fox between 1914 and 1919, including a legendary version of Cleopatra. At the peak of her fame, she was earning $4,000 a week. Here is the cruel twist. Almost all of her work is gone. A catastrophic fire at Fox's film storage vaults in 1937 destroyed nearly every one of her movies. Only 6 complete films survive. The Cleopatra that made her a sensation exists now as only a few seconds of footage. Theda Bara retired in 1926, having never appeared in a sound film. She married director Charles Brabin, lived quietly in Beverly Hills, and was by all accounts a warm, witty woman who bore little resemblance to the exotic creature Fox had invented. She died of stomach cancer in 1955, at 69. Her remains are here at Forest Lawn, interred under the name Theda Bara Brabin. Let's leave Forest Lawn, Glendale for a spell and drive a few miles east to Hollywood Forever Cemetery, the oldest cemetery in Hollywood, right next door to Paramount Studios. This is where we'll find one of the most visited graves in all of Los Angeles, and it belongs to the man who may have been the most famous human being on the planet when he died. His name was Rudolph Valentino. Born Rodolfo Guglielmi in a small town in southern Italy in 1895, Valentino came to America at 18, worked as a taxi dancer and a gardener in New York, and eventually drifted to Hollywood, where he landed bit parts in films. Then came The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse in 1921, and everything changed. His tango scene in that movie made women across America lose their minds. He followed it with The Sheik, Blood and Sand, and The Eagle, each one cementing his status as the movie's first great romantic idol, the original Latin lover. Men were suspicious of him. A famous editorial in the Chicago Tribune called him a pink powder puff and questioned his masculinity. Women simply adored him. In August of 1926, while in New York promoting his latest film, The Son of the Sheik, Valentino collapsed in his hotel room. He was rushed to the hospital where surgeons found a perforated gastric ulcer and a ruptured appendix. Peritonitis set in. Without modern antibiotics, there was nothing they could do. Rudolph Valentino died on August 23, 1926. He was 31 years old. What followed was pandemonium. An estimated 100,000 people filed past his body at Campbell's funeral parlor in Manhattan. Riots broke out in the streets. His body was shipped back to California, where a friend, the screenwriter June Mathis, offered her own pre-purchased crypt for his burial. She intended it to be temporary until a proper memorial could be built. That memorial was never built. Nearly a century later, Valentino remains in that borrowed crypt in the Cathedral Mausoleum at Hollywood Forever. Every year, on the anniversary of his death, fans still gather here. And for decades, a mysterious woman in black would appear, lay a single red rose at the crypt, and leave without a word. The tradition continues to this day. While we're here at Hollywood Forever, let's walk across the grounds to find another silent era giant. Norma Talmadge was, by most accounts, the single most popular actress in America throughout much of the 1920s. If that sounds like an exaggeration, consider this. In a 1924 poll, exhibitors ranked her the #1 female box office attraction in the country, ahead of Mary Pickford. Talmadge was born in New Jersey in 1893 and started acting in films as a teenager. She married the powerful producer Joseph Schenck, who built an entire production company around her. She specialized in dramatic roles, suffering heroines, tragic lovers, doomed women. Her fans worshipped her. She was also a sharp businesswoman who maintained considerable control over her projects. But when sound arrived, Norma Talmadge's heavy Brooklyn accent proved to be a devastating liability. Audiences that had swooned over her in silence laughed at her voice. After just 2 talkies, she retired. The story goes, and this may be apocryphal, that when a fan approached her outside Grauman's Chinese Theater and asked for an autograph, Talmadge replied, "Get away, dear. I don't need you anymore." Whether she actually said it or not, the quote became famous as a symbol of silent-era arrogance. In truth, Talmadge seemed perfectly happy to leave Hollywood behind. She married twice more after Schenck, lived well, and stayed out of the spotlight. She suffered a series of strokes in her later years and died in 1957 at 63. She is interred here at Hollywood Forever. In the 1920s, every schoolgirl in America knew her name. Today, even serious film buffs sometimes draw a blank. Nearby rests another leading man of the silent era whose name once drew enormous crowds but now draws mostly blank looks. John Gilbert was one of the highest-paid actors in Hollywood in the mid-1920s, a dashing romantic lead who starred opposite Greta Garbo in 3 films, including the smoldering Flesh and the Devil. Off-screen, he and Garbo were passionately involved. Their affair was the talk of Hollywood. Gilbert was also one of sound cinema's most famous casualties. The popular legend says his high voice killed his career when talkies arrived, but that's an oversimplification. His voice was perfectly adequate. You can hear it for yourself in his surviving sound films. The real problem was more complicated. His dramatic style, which thrived in the heightened emotions of silent cinema, seemed overwrought when accompanied by a microphone. Grand declarations of love that brought tears in silence drew snickers when spoken aloud. That, combined with a bitter feud with MGM chief Louis B. Mayer, sealed his fate. Mayer reportedly despised Gilbert after a personal insult at a party. Some say it happened the night of Gilbert's planned wedding to Garbo, which she famously didn't attend. And many believe Mayer deliberately sabotaged his sound films by assigning him inferior material. Whether that's true or not, Gilbert's career collapsed with stunning speed. He descended into alcoholism and married 4 times, including briefly to actress Virginia Bruce. By the mid-1930s, he was a shell of the man he had been. Greta Garbo, still loyal despite everything, insisted that he be cast opposite her in Queen Christina in 1933. But it wasn't enough to save him. John Gilbert died of a heart attack in January of 1936. He was only 38 years old. He rests here at Hollywood Forever, largely forgotten by the world that once couldn't get enough of him. If there's a cautionary tale in all of Hollywood about the cruelty of technological change, it's the story of Jack Gilbert. From Hollywood Forever, let's head south and west to Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, resting place of many Catholic stars of old Hollywood. Here we find Ramon Novarro, who was groomed by MGM to be the next Valentino. And for a while, it worked. Born in Mexico in 1899, Novarro fled to Los Angeles with his family during the Mexican Revolution. He was spectacularly handsome, often compared to Valentino, a comparison he both benefited from and resented, and became a major star in the 1920s, most famously in the title role of the 1925 epic Ben-Hur, the most expensive film made to that point. The chariot race in that picture was a sensation, and Novarro was its beating heart. He was also one of Hollywood's worst-kept secrets. Novarro was gay, at a time when that could destroy a career overnight. MGM carefully guarded his image, pairing him with various actresses for publicity photos, while Novarro conducted his personal life with discretion. Like many silent stars, Novarro struggled in the sound era, though he continued working in films and on television through the 1960s. He became a respected voice and acting teacher. On the night of October 30th, 1968, he was brutally murdered in his Hollywood Hills home by two brothers, Paul and Tom Ferguson, who believed the aging actor had a large amount of cash hidden in his house. He didn't. Ramon Novarro was 69 years old. His killers were convicted and served prison sentences. He rests here at Holy Cross, a man who once filled the biggest movie palaces in the world, taken from this life in a senseless act of violence. Also at Holy Cross Cemetery, just a short walk from Novarro, rests a woman who proves that forgetting can happen to the very biggest names. In the early 1940s, Betty Hutton was the #1 female star at Paramount Pictures. They called her the blonde bombshell, and not just because of her looks. Hutton had a volcanic energy on screen, a manic comedic style that audiences found irresistible. She replaced the ailing Judy Garland in the lead role of Annie Get Your Gun in 1950, and it became one of the top-grossing films of the year. 2 years later, she starred as trapeze artist and circus performer in Cecil B. DeMille's The Greatest Show on Earth, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture. But Hutton's personal life was a mess of broken marriages and battles with studio executives. After she insisted on having her husband direct her next film and Paramount refused, she walked away from her contract. It was a decision from which her career never recovered. The offers dried up, the money ran out. By the 1970s, she was working as a cook and housekeeper at a Catholic rectory in Rhode Island. She struggled with addiction and depression for years. Eventually, she found stability, returning briefly to performing and appearing on talk shows where audiences greeted her with genuine affection. Betty Hutton died in 2007 at the age of 86 from complications of colon cancer. She rests here at Holy Cross, a woman who went from the biggest star at a major studio to near total obscurity in the span of a single decade. Let's drive back toward Glendale and return to Forest Lawn because there are so many legends waiting for us in these hills. Our next stop brings us to a man who was the very definition of a matinee idol in the silent era. His name was Francis X. Bushman, and in the 1910s he was the most popular actor in America, arguably the first true movie star. Bushman was tall, powerfully built, and devastatingly handsome. Fan magazines compared him to a Greek god, and he played the part with relish, famously posing for photographs that emphasized his physique. He starred in hundreds of short films and features, and his fame was so great that exhibitors once voted him the most popular actor in the world. His crowning achievement was playing the villainous Messala in the original 1925 version of Ben-Hur, opposite our friend Ramon Novarro. But Bushman's career cratered when it was revealed that he had secretly been married and had 5 children. His studio had carefully concealed this to maintain his eligibility as a romantic fantasy. Fans felt betrayed, and his drawing power evaporated almost overnight. Bushman continued working steadily in smaller roles for decades, eventually transitioning to television. He appeared in episodes of various shows right up until the early 1960s. He died in 1966 at 83, still working. He rests here at Forest Lawn, a man who was once as famous as anyone on the planet, done in not by scandal in the traditional sense, but by the unforgivable crime of having a family. From a man who lived long, let's turn to one who didn't. Wallace Reid was the golden boy of early Hollywood. Tall, athletic, good-looking, and enormously talented. In the late 19-teens and early 1920s, he was one of the biggest stars in the business, appearing in dozens of films and known for playing wholesome, all-American heroes. Women adored him. Men wanted to be him. But behind the image, Reid was suffering. During the filming of a movie in 1919, he was involved in a serious train wreck on set and sustained painful injuries. Studio doctors, eager to keep their star working, treated him with morphine. He became addicted. For the next several years, Reid fought a losing battle with dependency while continuing to make films. His wife, actress Dorothy Davenport, eventually took him to a sanitarium in an attempt to save his life. It didn't work. Wallace Reid died in January of 1923 at just 31 years old. The official cause of death was listed as a combination of kidney failure and the effects of his addiction. His death became a national sensation and helped spark the first real public conversation about drug addiction in Hollywood. Dorothy Davenport went on to produce and direct a film called Human Wreckage, drawing on her husband's experience. Reid was interred at Forest Lawn, one of the earliest and most heartbreaking examples of a young star consumed by the machinery of the studio system. Speaking of the early days, let's visit a woman who was one of the true pioneers of comedy and film. Mabel Normand was making people laugh on screen before most Americans had ever been inside a movie theater. She was the comedy queen of the Mack Sennett studio, a gifted physical comedian, writer, and director who influenced everyone who came after her, including Charlie Chaplin, who credited Normand with teaching him the fundamentals of film comedy. Normand starred in and directed scores of short films in the early 19-teens, often performing her own dangerous stunts. She was fearless in front of the camera, diving into rivers, tumbling off moving vehicles, taking pies to the face and throwing them right back. She is often credited with being the first person to throw a pie in someone's face on screen, an act that would become one of comedy's most enduring gags. At the height of her fame, she was earning thousands of dollars a week and was beloved by audiences who saw her as the girl next door with perfect comic timing. But her life was touched by tragedy and scandal. She was closely associated with two of early Hollywood's most notorious incidents: the still unsolved murder of director William Desmond Taylor in 1922, Normand was one of the last people to see him alive, and a shooting involving her chauffeur in 1924. Though she was never charged with any crime in either case, the whiff of scandal was enough. In an era when studios were desperate to clean up Hollywood's image, Normand became collateral damage. She also battled tuberculosis for years. The disease, combined with what many believed was a drug problem, steadily eroded her health and her beauty. She married actor Lou Cody in 1926. Some said the marriage was a lark after a night of drinking, though the couple seemed genuinely fond of each other. Mabel Normand died of tuberculosis in February of 1930 at just 37 years old. She was interred at Calvary Cemetery in Los Angeles. A brilliant woman who helped invent screen comedy, remembered today mainly for tragedies that weren't her fault. Let's head up to the San Fernando Valley now, to Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills, a separate cemetery from Forest Lawn Glendale. Here rests a woman who was once the undisputed queen of the movie musical. Her name was Alice Faye, and in the late 1930s, she was one of the biggest stars at 20th Century Fox, the studio's answer to MGM's Jeanette MacDonald and Paramount's Dorothy Lamour. Faye's rise to stardom was almost accidental. Born Alice Jean Leppert in New York City's Hell's Kitchen neighborhood, she started as a chorus girl and was discovered by Rudy Vallee, who put her in his band. Fox signed her, and by the mid-30s, she was carrying major productions on her name alone. She had a warm, husky singing voice, lower and more intimate than the operatic sopranos who dominated musicals at the time, and audiences responded to her naturalness. She wasn't pretending to be glamorous, she just was. Faye starred in a string of popular musicals, including Alexander's ragtime band opposite Tyrone Power, whom we visited earlier on this tour, in Old Chicago and Tin Pan Alley. She was also known for introducing the song You'll Never Know, which won the Academy Award for Best Original Song in 1943. For several years running, she was among the top box office draws in the country, and Fox was building entire productions around her voice and her easygoing screen presence. Then, in 1945, something unusual happened. Faye starred in Fallen Angel, directed by Otto Preminger. When she saw the finished film, she discovered that Preminger had edited it to minimize her role and highlight her co-star, Linda Darnell. Furious, Faye walked off the Fox lot and essentially retired from movies at the age of 30. She married bandleader Phil Harris, raised a family, and only occasionally returned to performing. She did make one notable comeback, appearing in the 1962 remake of State Fair, but she never pursued stardom again with any urgency. Alice Faye lived to be 83, dying in 1998 of stomach cancer. She rests here at Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills, a woman who voluntarily walked away from the top of the mountain because she valued her dignity more than fame. While we're at Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills, let's visit a man whose face was on movie screens for 3 decades, but whose name has almost completely vanished. Robert Taylor was, in the 1930s and 40s, one of the biggest leading men at MGM. The studio marketed him as the man with the perfect profile, and it wasn't much of an exaggeration. He was almost absurdly handsome, with dark hair, a strong jawline, and an easy screen presence. Taylor starred opposite many of the era's biggest actresses: Greta Garbo in Camille, Vivien Leigh in Waterloo Bridge, and Elizabeth Taylor in Ivanhoe. He was also married to Barbara Stanwyck from 1939 to 1951, making them one of Hollywood's most glamorous couples. Unlike many matinee idols, Taylor served with distinction in World War II, enlisting in the Navy as a flight instructor. After the war, Taylor transitioned smoothly into westerns and action films, and later became the host and frequent star of the television series Death Valley Days. But the smoking that was ubiquitous among his generation caught up with him. Robert Taylor was diagnosed with lung cancer and died in June of 1969 at 57 years old. He rests here at Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills. If you've never seen Camille or Waterloo Bridge, you owe yourself the pleasure. He was far better than the pretty boy label suggested. From one heartthrob to another, let's drive over to Hollywood Forever Cemetery again, because there's a man here who, in the 1930s and 40s, was one of the top draws in all of Hollywood. Tyrone Power was the kind of star they simply don't make anymore, equally at home in swashbucklers, dramas, and musicals. He starred in The Mark of Zorro, Blood and Sand, The Razor's Edge, and Witness for the Prosecution, among many others. He was the top box office star at 20th Century Fox for much of his career, and he was the 3rd generation of his family to bear the name Tyrone Power. His father and grandfather were both successful stage actors. Power served as a Marine pilot in World War II, flying cargo missions in the Pacific Theater. He was one of the first major stars to enlist after Pearl Harbor, and he saw real service, not just the stateside publicity assignments that some actors accepted. After the war, he sought more serious roles and gave what many consider his finest performance in Nightmare Alley, a dark, disturbing film noir about a carnival con man who rises to fame as a fake spiritualist and then crashes spectacularly. It was a risky choice for a leading man known primarily for swashbucklers, and it showed a depth that audiences hadn't expected. He was also deeply passionate about the theater and spent years performing on stage in London and New York, including a well-received turn in John Brown's Body. In November of 1958, while filming a dueling scene for the movie Solomon and Sheba in Madrid, Tyrone Power suffered a massive heart attack. He was just 44 years old. His death stunned Hollywood. He was laid to rest here at Hollywood Forever, where his grave remains one of the more visited spots in the cemetery. Our tour continues at Woodlawn Cemetery in Santa Monica, where we'll pay our respects to a woman who held an almost unbelievable distinction. She was once the highest-paid actress in Hollywood, earning more than Bette Davis, more than Katharine Hepburn, more than anyone. Her name was Kay Francis, and if that name means nothing to you, that's precisely why she belongs on this tour. From 1932 to 1936, Francis was consistently ranked among the top 10 box office draws in America. She was tall, 5'9", statuesque for the era, elegant, sophisticated, and had a slight lisp that audiences found charming rather than distracting. She specialized in playing glamorous, worldly women, and she wore the most extravagant gowns in Hollywood with an ease that made other actresses jealous. Her wardrobe budgets were the stuff of legend. She starred in films like Trouble in Paradise, directed by the great Ernst Lubitsch, and One Way Passage, a romantic drama opposite William Powell that became a classic. Warner Brothers built entire pictures around her, and for several years, she was the studio's biggest female star. But fashions change, and by the late 30s, the studio was openly trying to get rid of her, assigning her to lesser scripts and smaller productions in what was known around the lot as a deliberate campaign to reduce her status. Frances, to her credit, showed up for every one of those pictures and gave them her best. She retired from acting after World War II, during which she'd entertained troops overseas, and spent her remaining years in relative obscurity. Kay Frances died of cancer in 1968 at 63. She is interred at Woodlawn Cemetery, a woman who was once literally at the top of the Hollywood salary chart and is now almost entirely unknown. Let's make our way to Valhalla Memorial Park Cemetery in North Hollywood, where we find the resting place of a man who was, for a time, the biggest comedy star in the world, not named Chaplin. His name was Harold Lloyd, and he was the third genius of silent comedy, alongside Chaplin and Buster Keaton. Lloyd is best remembered for that iconic image: a young man in round horn-rimmed glasses dangling from the hands of a clock high above a city street. That scene from the 1923 film Safety Last remains one of the most famous images in all of cinema. You've seen it even if you've never seen the movie. But Lloyd was far more than one scene. He made dozens of feature films and hundreds of shorts, and during the 1920s, his films actually outgrossed both Chaplin's and Keaton's at the box office. He was the top draw in comedy for much of the decade, a remarkable achievement that has been largely forgotten. Where Chaplin played the little tramp and Keaton played the great stone-face, Lloyd played an optimistic, all-American go-getter, the kind of energetic young man who could climb the side of a building on sheer enthusiasm alone. Unlike his contemporaries, Lloyd was also a shrewd businessman who retained ownership of most of his films. He invested wisely in Southern California real estate and became one of the wealthiest men in Hollywood. He lived in a magnificent estate called Green Acres, a 44-room Italian Renaissance mansion on 16 acres in Beverly Hills, where he hosted legendary parties and pursued his passions for photography and collecting. He was an avid photographer who took over 40,000 images, many of them in early stereo 3D, a technology that fascinated him decades before it became commercially viable. Harold Lloyd died of prostate cancer in 1971 at the age of 77. He was interred here at Valhalla Memorial Park, though his estate was later donated to the city. Of the three great silent comedians, Lloyd is probably the least remembered today, which is a shame. His films are fast, funny, and thrilling, and they haven't aged a day. Let me take us instead to Calvary Cemetery in East Los Angeles, one of the city's oldest Catholic cemeteries. Here rests the great John Barrymore, known throughout his career by a single, magnificent nickname: the Great Profile. John Barrymore was, by wide consensus, the greatest American actor of his generation. He came from theater royalty. The Barrymore family was American stage aristocracy, and his Hamlet on Broadway in 1922 was hailed as the definitive performance of the role. He was dashing, brilliant, and wildly charismatic. In Hollywood, he starred in films like Grand Hotel, 20th Century, and the 1920 silent classic Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, in which he performed the transformation without makeup, using only his facial muscles. But Barrymore was also a devastating alcoholic. By the 1930s, his drinking had become so severe that he sometimes couldn't remember his lines and had to read them from cue cards. His later career devolved into self-parody, as he took roles that exploited his reputation as a dissolute genius. He was married 4 times, including to actress Dolores Costello, and his personal life was a rolling catastrophe of excess and regret. John Barrymore collapsed during a radio rehearsal in May of 1942 and died 10 days later of kidney failure complicated by cirrhosis. He was 60 years old. He rests at Calvary Cemetery, where visitors still come to pay their respects to a man whose talent was as enormous as his self-destruction. From one grand old Hollywood name to another, let's visit a woman who, like Marie Dressler, achieved her greatest fame in the twilight of her career. Or rather, who achieved it twice. Gloria Swanson was the biggest female star of the silent era, a glamorous, imperious presence who earned millions and spent them just as fast. In the 1920s, she was Hollywood's ultimate diva. She reportedly spent $8 million in that decade alone. She was nominated for the first-ever Academy Award for Best Actress for Sadie Thompson in 1928. When sound arrived, Swanson's career faded gradually, and by the 1940s she was largely retired, dabbling in business ventures and living in New York. Then Billy Wilder came calling with a script that would change both their legacies. He offered her the role of Norma Desmond, a delusional former silent film star living in a crumbling mansion on Sunset Boulevard, attended only by her devoted former director and butler, played by the real-life silent film legend Erich von Stroheim. Swanson agreed, and the result was one of the most unforgettable performances in movie history. "I am big," she declares in the film's most famous line. "It's the pictures that got small." The role earned her a third Oscar nomination and became her defining legacy, a bitter irony since Swanson herself was reportedly ambivalent about being forever associated with a character who was, essentially, a grotesque caricature of faded stardom. The film blurred the line between fiction and reality in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. William Holden, playing the young screenwriter who becomes Desmond's kept man, later said the atmosphere on set was eerie. Several other real silent stars appeared in the film as Desmond's card-playing companions, lending the whole enterprise an air of genuine melancholy. After Sunset Boulevard, Swanson dabbled in television and business ventures. She became an early advocate for health foods and organic living, decades before those ideas were fashionable. Gloria Swanson died of a heart ailment in New York in 1983, at 84. She was cremated, and her ashes were reportedly scattered. But the character of Norma Desmond remains deathless, a monument to what happens when the spotlight moves on. Let's travel now a bit further afield. We're heading out to the San Fernando Mission Cemetery in Mission Hills, where rests a man who represents one of the more peculiar stories on our tour. William Haines was, in 1930, the #1 box office star in America. He was charming, athletic, and funny. MGM's golden boy. He starred in popular comedies like Tell It to the Marines and Show People. He was also openly gay, at least within the film industry, at a time when that was career poison. For years, MGM tolerated his relationship with his partner, Jimmy Shields. But in the early 1930s, as the production code tightened its grip on Hollywood, the studio gave Haines an ultimatum: end the relationship or end his career. Haines chose his partner. He walked away from a career at its absolute peak. What happened next is the remarkable part. Haines reinvented himself as an interior decorator and became spectacularly successful at it. He designed homes for some of Hollywood's biggest names, including Joan Crawford, who remained a devoted friend for life. Haines and Shields stayed together for nearly 50 years, until Haines died of lung cancer in 1973 at 74. Jimmy Shields, devastated by the loss, took his own life a few months later. They are buried together here at San Fernando Mission Cemetery, one of the earliest and most touching love stories in Hollywood history, hidden for decades because the world wasn't ready to hear it. Returning to Forest Lawn, Glendale, we keep coming back here because so many of these stories converge in this one place. Let's visit a woman who was the biggest star you've never heard of. Marion Davies was one of the most gifted comedic actresses of the silent era and into the early talkies. She could do physical comedy, she could do romance, and she had an infectious charm that came through on screen every single time. She was also the mistress of William Randolph Hearst, the most powerful newspaper publisher in America. Hearst was 34 years her senior and utterly devoted to her. He built a media empire that included a film production company, Cosmopolitan Pictures, specifically to showcase Davies. He poured millions of his own money into her productions and used his newspapers to promote her relentlessly. The irony is that she didn't need his help. She was naturally talented, especially in comedy. But Hearst kept pushing her into serious dramatic roles that didn't suit her. and the public came to see her as a kept woman rather than a skilled performer. It was a reputation she didn't deserve. When Orson Welles made Citizen Kane in 1941, the character of Susan Alexander, the untalented singer pushed into the spotlight by a media tycoon, was widely seen as a portrait of Davies. It infuriated both Hearst and Davies, and it was deeply unfair. Davies was nothing like Susan Alexander. She was a genuine talent whose gifts were buried under the weight of her patrons' good intentions. Davies was also legendarily generous. During the Depression, she donated substantial sums to charity and helped fund a children's clinic. After Hearst's death in 1951, Davies married for the first time to a sea captain named Horace Brown and lived comfortably until her death from cancer in 1961 at 64. She is interred at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, a woman who deserved to be remembered for her talent and instead became a footnote in someone else's story. Let's head to Kensico Cemetery in Valhalla, New York, a different Valhalla from the one we visited in North Hollywood. This is one of the grand old cemeteries of the Northeast, and it's where we'll find a woman who holds a unique place in movie history. Janet Gaynor was the very first person to win the Academy Award for Best Actress, taking home the prize at the inaugural ceremony in 1929 for her performances in 3 films: Seventh Heaven, Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans, and Street Angel. Gaynor was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, with large expressive eyes and a sweetness that audiences found irresistible. She was the top female box office draw in the early sound era, and she gave a memorable performance in the original 1937 version of A Star is Born, for which she received another Oscar nomination. After that film, she gradually stepped away from Hollywood, married costume designer Adrian, and focused on painting and family life. In 1982, Gaynor was involved in a terrible car accident in San Francisco. The car she was riding in was struck by a drunk driver. She survived but suffered serious injuries, including damage to her pelvis, ribs, and bladder. She also developed pneumonia during her recovery. 2 years later, Janet Gaynor died from the lingering effects of those injuries. She was 77 years old. She rests at Kensico Cemetery, the woman who started it all, the first Best Actress, largely forgotten by the generations that followed. From New York, let's head back to California. At Arlington National Cemetery. Actually, no, let's stay in the world of Hollywood glamour. We're heading to the Hillside Memorial Park in Culver City and then onward. But first, a detour to the old Westchester Hills Cemetery in Hastings-on-Hudson, New York. Here we find Constance Bennett, who in 1931 and 32 was the highest paid actress in Hollywood. Not the most popular, the highest paid. She earned an astonishing $30,000 a week, a figure that made headlines across the country during the Depression. Bennett came from acting royalty. Her father was matinee idol Richard Bennett, and her younger sister was the equally famous Joan Bennett. Constance was witty, sophisticated, and razor-sharp, and she excelled in comedies and dramas alike. Her biggest hits included What Price Hollywood, a 1932 film that served as the basis for A Star is Born, and Topper, the 1937 fantasy comedy in which she played a glamorous ghost opposite Cary Grant. But Bennett was also a shrewd businesswoman who grew bored with acting. She launched her own cosmetics line, invested in real estate, and dabbled in fashion design. By the 1940s, she was spending more time on her business ventures than on film sets. She continued making occasional movies and television appearances, and she remained a fixture of New York society. In 1965, while visiting a military base in West Germany to perform a benefit show, Constance Bennett suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and died. She was 60 years old. She rests in New York, a woman who was once the highest-paid star in the world and who had the sense to diversify her portfolio long before that was common Hollywood wisdom. Back to Los Angeles. Let's visit Forest Lawn, Glendale one more time because there's a man here who deserves to be remembered. Wallace Beery was one of the most bankable stars in Hollywood during the 1930s. A hulking, gruff, unlikely leading man who audiences absolutely loved. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor for the Champ in 1931, tying with Frederick March, and he was paired memorably with Marie Dressler, whom we visited earlier on our tour, in Min and Bill and Tugboat Annie. Together, Dressler and Beery were one of the most popular screen teams in the country, a pair of lovable roughnecks who audiences couldn't resist. Beery had started in silence, playing villains and heavies. He even played a Swedish maid in some of Max Sennett's early comedies, performing in drag. His first wife was Gloria Swanson, whom we also met earlier today. That marriage was brief and, by Swanson's account, deeply miserable. She accused him of cruelty. But Beery found his niche as a lovable lug in sound pictures, and for much of the 30s, he was one of MGM's most reliable earners. He starred in Viva Villa, Dinner at 8, alongside the great John Barrymore, and a string of adventure films that kept audiences coming back. Wallace Beery died of a heart attack in 1949 at the age of 64. He rests at Forest Lawn, Glendale, in the same cemetery as his ex-wife Swanson. Well, Swanson was cremated, so they're not exactly neighbors. But the connection is there. Two people who were once married. Both giants of Hollywood, both largely forgotten. A few miles away, at Woodlawn Cemetery in Santa Monica, rests a man whose career spans from the silent era to the golden age of television. Don Ameche was a versatile leading man who starred in dozens of films in the 1930s and 40s, most famously as Alexander Graham Bell in the 1939 biographical film The Story of Alexander Graham Bell. The film was such a hit that, for a time, the slang term for a telephone was an Ameche. Ameche was charming, urbane, and had a warm baritone voice perfectly suited for the talkies. He starred opposite Alice Faye, whom we visited earlier, in several Fox musicals, and he was a reliable box office draw for over a decade. But by the 1950s, his film career had wound down, and he transitioned to theater and television work. Then came the most unlikely second act. In 1985, at the age of 77, Ameche starred in Ron Howard's Cocoon and won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. His energetic breakdancing scene in that film delighted audiences, and it was widely seen as one of Hollywood's great comeback moments. He continued working steadily for several more years. Don Ameche died of prostate cancer in 1993 at 85. He rests at Resurrection Cemetery in Aston, Pennsylvania, not in California, as you might expect. Even in death, he surprised people. Let's cross the country again, briefly, to Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, where rests one of the most unusual figures on our tour. Joe E. Brown was one of the top box office draws in America throughout the early 1930s, a comedian famous for one physical attribute above all others, his enormous mouth. It was the widest mouth in show business, and Brown used it to spectacular comedic effect, opening it in exaggerated displays of shock, horror, and delight. Brown started as a child acrobat in the circus before moving to vaudeville and then Broadway. He made the transition to films effortlessly, starring in popular Warner Brothers comedies that made him one of the studio's biggest earners. He was also a devoted baseball fan who once owned a minor league team. During World War II, he was one of the first entertainers to travel overseas to perform for troops, and he was tireless in his efforts, visiting military hospitals and combat zones for years. His most enduring role came late in his career, playing Osgood Fielding III in Billy Wilder's Some Like It Hot in 1959. His final line in the film, the famous response to Jack Lemmon's revelation, remains one of the greatest closing lines in movie history. I won't spoil it if you haven't seen it. Joe E. Brown died in 1973 at the age of 81. He rests at Ferncliff Cemetery, a man whose face made millions laugh and whose heart made thousands of servicemen feel less alone. Let's head back west now, to Glendale once more. There is a story here at Forest Lawn that I find particularly haunting. Marie Prevost was a beautiful and popular actress of the silent era, a petite Canadian who was discovered by Max Sennett and became one of his most popular bathing beauties. She starred in a string of successful films throughout the 1920s, The Marriage Circle, directed by Ernst Lubitsch, and Kiss Me Again among them. But when sound arrived, Prevost's career began to falter. Her weight fluctuated, and in an industry that was then, as now, unforgiving about such things, The leading roles stopped coming. She was reduced to bit parts and extras work. Depression set in. Alcohol became her companion. In January of 1937, Marie Prevost was found dead in her Hollywood apartment. She was 40 years old. She had been dead for some time before anyone noticed. Her small dachshund, Maxie, was found alive in the apartment and had apparently been trying to wake her. The official cause of death was acute alcoholism, though malnutrition likely played a role. The punk band The Meatmen later immortalized her story in a darkly comic song, though the details they included were exaggerated. Marie Prevost was originally buried in an unmarked grave at Hollywood Forever Cemetery. It took decades before a proper marker was placed. She rests there now, remembered at last, a cautionary tale about how quickly Hollywood discards the people it once adored. From tragedy, let's find some warmth. We're heading to Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills to visit a woman whose sarong became one of the most iconic costumes in movie history. Dorothy Lamour made her name in a series of exotic adventure pictures in the late 1930s, wearing a sarong that became her trademark. Born Mary Lita Dorothy Slayton in New Orleans, she worked as an elevator operator and a beauty queen before winning the Miss New Orleans pageant and parlaying it into a singing career and then Hollywood. She was beautiful, she could sing, and she was game for absolutely anything a director threw at her. But what really made Lamour famous were the road pictures, the beloved comedy series she made with Bob Hope and Bing Crosby, starting with Road to Singapore in 1940. Those films were enormous hits, loose and improvisational in a way that audiences found irresistible. Hope and Crosby would break the fourth wall, ad-lib shamelessly, and generally make a mess of the plot. And Lamour was right there with them, holding her own against two of the quickest wits in show business. She appeared in 7 road films in total, from Singapore in 1940 to Hong Kong in 1962. Her timing was impeccable, and she gave as good as she got, which is no small thing when your co-stars are Bob Hope and Bing Crosby. After the road films wound down, Lamour continued working in nightclubs, television, and the occasional film. She was a devoted war bonds saleswoman during World War II, reportedly helping sell over $300 million in bonds. Dorothy Lamour died of a heart attack in 1996 at 81. She rests at Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills, the woman who wore the sarong and held her own against two of the funniest men in show business. Nearby at Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills, we find a man who specialized in one particular kind of role, and he played it so well that he became indispensable to an entire genre. Dan Duryea was the quintessential film noir villain, the sneering, slapping, double-crossing heel who made audiences hiss. He appeared in some of the greatest noirs ever made, including The Woman in the Window, Scarlet Street, and Criss Cross. Duryea had a thin, angular face and a nasal voice that dripped with menace. He could make you loathe him within 30 seconds of appearing on screen. And yet, by all accounts, Duryea was one of the nicest people in Hollywood, a devoted family man who stayed married to the same woman for over 20 years and was active in his church. The gap between the man and the persona couldn't have been wider. Dan Duryea died of cancer in 1968 at the age of 61. He rests here at Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills, the man you love to hate, who turned out to be the neighbor you'd want to have. Still at Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills, not far from Duryea, we find a grave that belongs to one of the more heartbreaking figures in all of Hollywood. Mae Murray was once known as the girl with the bee-stung lips and the gardenia of the screen. In the 1920s, she was an absolute sensation, a former Ziegfeld Follies dancer who became one of the highest-paid actresses in silent pictures. Her most famous role was in The Merry Widow, directed by Erich von Stroheim in 1925. She was glamorous, extravagant, and lived like a queen. Then everything fell apart. Her marriage to a Georgian prince, David Mandavani, ended in a brutal divorce in which she lost custody of her son. Her career evaporated with the coming of sound. Her fortune was squandered. By the 1940s, Mae Murray, once one of the most famous women in the world, was living in near total poverty, sometimes sleeping on park benches in New York City. She was discovered by authorities in a state of severe confusion and placed in a nursing home. The Motion Picture and Television Fund eventually stepped in and provided for her final years at the Motion Picture Country home. Mae Murray died of heart disease in 1965 at the age of 80. She rests here at Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills, a woman whose fall from grace was as dramatic as any film she ever made. Let's take a short drive now to Calvary Cemetery in East Los Angeles, where alongside John Barrymore rests a woman who was one of the great international stars of early cinema. Pola Negri was a Polish-born actress who conquered European cinema before arriving in Hollywood in 1922, already a major star. She was exotic, passionate, and temperamental, everything silent-era audiences craved. Paramount signed her to a lavish contract, and she became one of the studio's biggest draws, starring in films like Forbidden Paradise and Hotel Imperial. Negri was also famous for her off-screen drama. She had highly publicized romances with Charlie Chaplin and Rudolph Valentino, and when Valentino died in 1926, Negri's grief was the most theatrical display at the funeral. She fainted repeatedly for the cameras, and the press questioned whether her anguish was genuine. It was a public relations disaster from which she never fully recovered. The arrival of sound, combined with her thick Polish accent, effectively ended her American career. She returned to Europe, where she continued making films in Germany and France before retiring. In her later years, Negri lived quietly in San Antonio, Texas, of all places, having become a recluse. She died of a brain tumor and pneumonia in 1987 at age 90. She rests at Calvary Cemetery here in Los Angeles, having requested burial near Valentino's adopted home, one of the last true divas of the silent screen. From Los Angeles, let's travel for the first time to the outskirts of the city to find a woman who was a genuine international treasure. Dolores del Rio rests at Panteón de Dolores in Mexico City, not in California, but her story is so intertwined with Hollywood that she belongs on this tour. She was the first major Latin American movie star, and for much of the 1930s, she was one of the most beautiful and sought-after actresses in the world. She starred in Bird of Paradise, Flying Down to Rio, the film that introduced Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers as a team, and several other notable pictures. But Del Rio grew frustrated with Hollywood's tendency to cast her in exoticized, stereotypical roles. In the early 1940s, she made the remarkable decision to leave Hollywood at the height of her fame and return to Mexico, where she became the defining actress of the Mexican golden age of cinema. She starred in masterpieces by director Emilio Fernandez, including Maria Candelaria, which won the Grand Prix at the Cannes Film Festival in 1946. She became a beloved cultural icon in Mexico, celebrated far more deeply than she ever had been in the United States. Del Rio returned to Hollywood occasionally in later years, appearing in John Ford's Cheyenne Autumn in 1964. She died in 1983 at the age of 78 from liver disease. She was mourned as a national heroine in Mexico. In the United States, she was already largely forgotten, a woman who chose artistic integrity over Hollywood fame and was richly rewarded in her homeland for the choice. Back in California, let's visit one more resting place before we reach the end of our journey. At Desert Memorial Park in Cathedral City, near Palm Springs, we find a man who was once half of the most popular romantic team in movie history. Charles Farrell, paired with Janet Gaynor, whom we visited earlier, was the romantic leading man of the late 1920s. Together, they made a dozen films, including Seventh Heaven and Street Angel, and audiences loved them with a devotion that was almost religious. They were known as America's favorite lovebirds. Farrell was tall, athletic, and had a gentle screen presence that complemented Gaynor's delicacy. When the talkies arrived, his career held up reasonably well, though by the mid-30s the magic had faded. He transitioned smoothly into other ventures, becoming the mayor of Palm Springs and later starring in the early television sitcom My Little Margie, which ran for several seasons in the early 1950s. He also co-founded the Palm Springs Racquet Club, which became a popular gathering spot for Hollywood's elite. Charles Farrell lived to be 89, dying in 1990 of natural causes. He rests at Desert Memorial Park, not far from Frank Sinatra. A man who found a second life after stardom, and who seemed genuinely content with the quieter version. Let's return to Forest Lawn, Glendale, where another nearly forgotten leading man awaits. Richard Dix was one of the biggest male stars of the late silent era and early talkies, a rugged presence who earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor at the very first ceremony. And he starred in one of the early Best Picture winners, Cimarron, in 1931. Dix was rugged and athletic, perfectly suited for adventure films and westerns. Throughout the 1930s, he was a reliable headliner at RKO, starring in a long series of action pictures and mystery films. But by the 40s, his health was declining, and his roles were shrinking. He suffered a series of heart attacks and retired from acting in 1947. Richard Dix died of a heart attack in 1949 at 56. He rests at Forest Lawn, Glendale, another leading man whose name was once as big as Hollywood itself. From Glendale, let's make our way to one more stop at Holy Cross Cemetery. Here lies a woman whose talent was incandescent and whose life ended far too early. Anne Harding was one of the most acclaimed actresses of the early talkie era, a tall, blonde beauty with a regal bearing and a lovely voice that made her an immediate star when sound arrived. She received an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress for Holiday in 1930, playing the role of a free-spirited society woman, a part that Katharine Hepburn would later make famous in the 1938 remake. Harding specialized in intelligent, refined heroines, and for several years she was a major draw at RKO and other studios. But Hollywood tastes shifted, and by the mid-30s she was already losing ground to younger stars. She continued working in supporting roles in films and on television through the 1960s, including a memorable appearance in the musical The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. Anne Harding died of natural causes in 1981 at the age of 79. She rests at Holy Cross Cemetery, one of those names that once graced every movie marquee in America and now barely registers. If you find a copy of her Holiday, watch it. She's magnificent. Let's visit one more silent era legend before we move on. At Forest Lawn, Glendale rests Richard Barthelmess, who was, in the late teens and 1920s, one of the most respected and popular actors in Hollywood. He was handsome, but not flashy, talented, but not showy, the kind of actor that critics adored. He starred in D.W. Griffith's Broken Blossoms and Way Down East, both considered masterpieces of silent cinema. Lillian Gish, who worked with all the great actors of that era, once said Barthelmess was the most beautiful man who ever stepped before a camera. When the first Academy Awards were held in 1929, Barthelmess was nominated for Best Actor. He made a successful transition to sound and continued starring in films through the 1930s, though his career gradually wound down. His last significant role was in the Howard Hawks classic Only Angels Have Wings in 1939, where he played a disgraced pilot seeking redemption, and more than held his own against the film's star, Cary Grant. After that, Barthelmess retired and served in the Naval Reserve during World War II. He died of cancer in 1963 at 68. He rests at Forest Lawn, Glendale, one of the silent era's true artists, more admired than remembered. We're nearing the end of our tour now, but there are still a few stories that need telling. Let's go to Colleen Moore, who rests at Holy Cross Cemetery. Moore was the actress who, more than anyone else, popularized the bobbed hair flapper look that defined the 1920s. Before Clara Bow became the It Girl, Colleen Moore was the It Girl. Her film Flaming Youth, released in 1923, essentially launched the flapper craze in American cinema. She was the top female box office star in 1926 and 27, and at the peak of her popularity, she was earning $12,500 a week. Moore was also remarkably shrewd about money. Unlike so many silent stars who were ruined by the transition to sound or by poor financial decisions, Moore invested wisely and became a millionaire many times over. She was also famous for building a fairy tale-themed dollhouse that was valued at over $500,000 and toured the country raising money for children's charities. After retiring from films in the early 1930s, Moore wrote a well-regarded memoir called Silent Star and worked as a stockbroker. She died in 1988 at 99. She rests at Holy Cross Cemetery, a woman who embodied the roaring 20s and had the good sense to save for a rainy day. From one leading lady to another, let's return to Forest Lawn, Glendale, where two names that were once inseparable rest in the same cemetery. Jeanette MacDonald and Nelson Eddy were the most popular romantic musical team of the 1930s. Their films together for MGM, Naughty Marietta, Rosemarie, Maytime, Sweethearts, were massive box office hits that made both of them household names. Audiences adored their pairing, and fan clubs devoted to the duo persisted for decades after their last film together. MacDonald was the bigger star of the two when they first teamed up. She had already been a leading lady in films by Ernst Lubitsch and Ruben Mamoulian, and she had a trained operatic soprano voice that was genuinely impressive. Eddy was a baritone from Rhode Island who had performed with opera companies before MGM put him in films. Together, their voices blended beautifully, and their on-screen chemistry, even if it sometimes tipped into the saccharine, was undeniable. By the 1940s, the public's appetite for operetta-style musicals had waned and the team was dissolved. MacDonald continued performing on stage and television, while Eddy pursued a successful nightclub career. Jeanette MacDonald died of a heart attack in 1965 at 61. Nelson Eddy died of a cerebral hemorrhage in 1967 at 65, collapsing on stage during a performance in Miami Beach. Both rest at Forest Lawn, Glendale. If you mention them to anyone under 60 today, the odds of recognition are slim. But for their generation, the duets from Rosemarie were as thrilling as anything the movies had to offer. Our next to last stop brings us back to Hollywood Forever Cemetery for one more visit. Here rests Constance Talmadge, the younger sister of Norma Talmadge, whom we visited earlier. In the 1920s, Constance was one of the most popular comedic actresses in America. Where Norma specialized in melodrama and suffering, Constance was all lightness and mischief. She was the funny sister, vivacious, quick-witted, and enormously charming. She starred in hit comedies like Her Sister from Paris and Venus of Venice, and she was a favorite of audiences who wanted to laugh rather than cry. She was also one of the wealthier women in Hollywood, thanks to smart investments and the business acumen of her mother, Peg Talmadge, who managed both daughters' careers with an iron hand. When sound arrived, Constance simply walked away. Unlike her sister Norma, whose attempt at talkies was humiliating, Constance made the choice on her own terms. She had plenty of money, she had no interest in proving anything, and she wanted to enjoy her life. She married several times, traveled the world, and lived comfortably until her death from pneumonia in 1973 at 74. She rests at Hollywood Forever close to her sister, a woman who had the rare wisdom to quit while she was ahead. Let's visit one final figure at Forest Lawn, Glendale. And it feels right to close our tour with someone who, like Clara Bow at the beginning, represents the devastating brevity of silent-era fame. Her name was Corinne Griffith, and she was known throughout the 1920s as the Orchid Lady of the Screen. That nickname gives you some idea of how audiences perceived her. She was considered one of the most beautiful women in the world, a luminous presence who graced the covers of countless fan magazines. She was a major star at Vitagraph and later at First National Pictures, headlining popular dramas and romances throughout the decade. Her talent was recognized by the Academy as well. She earned a nomination for Best Actress for The Divine Lady in 1929, one of the earliest Oscar ceremonies. But sound destroyed her career almost instantly. Her voice, or rather what audiences perceived as the mismatch between her ethereal beauty and her ordinary speaking voice, ended her time as a leading lady. It's one of the recurring tragedies of our tour. So many of these careers were ended not by a lack of talent, but by the simple fact that a new technology changed the rules overnight. Griffith retired from acting and reinvented herself completely. She became a successful businesswoman and author, writing several books, including a novel and a memoir about Hollywood. She was also involved in real estate and various civic causes, including a famously quixotic campaign to abolish the income tax. She also became increasingly eccentric in later years, at one point filing a legal claim that she was not actually Corinne Griffith at all, but rather a stand-in who had replaced the real Corinne Griffith years earlier. The purpose of this bizarre assertion was never entirely clear, though some speculated it was connected to a financial dispute. It remains one of old Hollywood's strangest footnotes. Corinne Griffith died of a heart attack in 1979 at the age of 84. She rests at Forest Lawn, Glendale, the orchid lady of the screen, once considered the most beautiful woman in the movies, now known mostly to the small community of silent film devotees who keep these flames alive. And with that, friends, our tour comes to an end. We've visited 40 people today, men and women who, in their time, were as famous as anyone alive. They filled the movie palaces from New York to San Francisco. They stared out from the covers of photoplay and motion picture magazine. They earned fortunes and lost them, married glamorously and divorced spectacularly, and made millions of strangers laugh and cry and fall in love in the dark. And now they rest in quiet places across California and beyond, their names known mostly to those of us who take the time to look back. Fame is a strange and fleeting thing. Every person on this tour believed, at some point, that their name would last forever. And, for a while, it did. But the world moves on, new faces replace old ones, and the pictures really do get small. Or at least the audience moves to a different screen. What endures isn't the fame itself, it's the work. Somewhere tonight, someone is watching Clara Bow light up a silent screen for the first time, or hearing Jeanette MacDonald's voice soar in an old musical, or watching Humphrey Bogart and John Barrymore share the screen in a film neither of them thought much about at the time. The work is still there, waiting. Thank you for walking with us today. The stories are still here for anyone willing to listen.